John chapter 13, verses 31 to 38. When he was gone, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times.
John chapter 14, verses 1 to 4. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the place. You know the way to the place where I am going."
What if I'm wrong? Been deceived all along. What if I'm wrong?
What have I done? Did I waste a life just for fun? What have I done?
What did I do? I did what voices told me to. What did I do?
Where will I go? Will I sink through fire down below? Where will I go?
Any chance of salvation? Any chance for me? Any chance of salvation for eternity? Any chance of salvation? Someone died for me, washed in blood, cared enough to pity me.
Why do I care? What's wrong with me? My hate is gone. Why do I care?
When did I change? What's different now? It's very strange. When did I change? Any chance of salvation? Any chance for me? Any chance of salvation for eternity? Any chance of salvation? Someone died for me, washed in blood, cared enough to pity me.
In my heart things new that's very old, like a pain that's finally gone. I feel my heavy burden lifted.
Any chance of salvation, any chance for me, any chance of salvation for eternity, any chance of salvation, any chance for me, any chance of salvation for eternity.
The song that Aline and Keegan played a little while ago is an interesting one, because when it was written, the songwriter had very much in his mind the question of whether anybody is beyond the love of God, whether anybody is beyond salvation. And you are meant to come to the conclusion, no, no one is beyond the love of God. Now, there's a very important point about this in this passage, in that Jesus here predicts that Peter will deny him. He famously rebukes Peter for saying that he would lay down his life for Jesus, and warns him that before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Now, if we have a correct understanding of the Christian faith, we understand that we can only belong to the Christian brother and sisterhood. We can only belong to the family of God if we have accepted that we are sinners, if we have accepted that we are amongst the number of people that sometimes do things wrong. And there's another danger here, in that sometimes we think that as well as doing things wrong before we become Christians, we may slip into the habit of thinking that we are better than others after we become Christians. This leads to self-righteousness and judgmentalism, and leads to over-concern about the sins of others, the wrongdoing of others, rather than the things that we do. We're well to remember that after Judas departed, which we talked about last week, there were 11 disciples who were with Jesus. And between this passage and the time of the Last Supper and beyond, all 11 of them fled. And come the day of the crucifixion, there was a very small group indeed gathered at the foot of the cross. It has to be said that they were mostly ladies. But don't feel too smug about that, ladies. Ladies also fail God. It's not just the men. It's interesting that when Jesus' body was taken down from the cross, Joseph and Nicodemus, two of the Jewish leaders, were the ones who requested that his body be given to them and placed in a good tomb, a place of honor. None of the disciples were part of that activity. So we begin to realize that there is great truth in what Jesus said elsewhere, that it is not the healthy who need a physician. It is not the healthy who need a doctor. It is the sick. There's the old joke, people say, "Oh, I don't like hospitals. They're full of sick and dying people." Churches are full of sick people as well, but they are full of people who are aware that they have had and are recovering from a spiritual sickness, an enmity towards God. Last week I pointed out to you that there's a very stark phrase at the end of the passage that we read, where it said in a very poetic way, "And it was night." Now the contrast here is that Jesus says, "Now the Son of Man is glorified." It's difficult to imagine something as dark as night bringing light, which is really how we think of glorification, to the Son of God, the Son of Man. But this is God's work, that out of darkness he brings light. Out of evil he brings good. Out of things that are bad he brings new beginnings. Out of death he brings regeneration, which is one of those posh things that we say, which means something similar to the common phrase we use to be born again or born from above. We are born here in this world, but God brings something new into our lives if we are willing to serve him, but also to serve one another. Which then brings us to the second part of this passage that we've had read for us. Jesus says in verse 34, "A new command or a new commandment I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." We have a terrible record of doing this well. We are not good at it. But I like to believe that Jesus knew that this, in a way, was a yardstick by which we would know our better days from the days that we fail. Love one another. If we look at the church around the world, we see a church that is divided into all kinds of various groups. A few hundred years ago, a guy called Martin Luther in Germany, not to be confused with Martin Luther King Jr. in America, Martin Luther in Germany, decided it would be a good idea to reform the church and to make it better. It didn't work. First of all, the Reformation was rejected and led only to part of the church splitting off from another part of the church. And it kind of created an example, because once you have created an impression that it's all right to split something into parts, then that will happen over and over and over again. How many parts do we need to make something just right? It just goes on down the centuries. Originally, there were all churches that called themselves Catholic. I want to distinguish that between what we now call Roman Catholic, because Catholic just means worldwide, a worldwide church that all believers belong to. And then a few centuries later, in a theological argument which now seems very small but at the time seemed very big, the Orthodox Church in the East split off from the church in the West. And then the time of the reforming of the church which failed, the Protestant churches split off from the Roman churches, and then there were three groups. And then within the Protestant churches, there were Pentecostalist churches, who then split off into two primary groups, Elim and Assemblies of God. Baptist churches, or originally the Anabaptist churches, who then split off to the Anabaptists and the Baptists. Church of England in this country, who then split off into the Methodist Church and the Salvation Army. And you don't want to know how many Presbyterian denominations there are in America, because they fall out all the time about all kinds of little things. So church organizations, are not good at this. But surely as individual believers, we will be better than organizations. But no, we fall out all of the time. And Jesus says that his yardstick is that we must love one another. Not that we may love one another, or perhaps on a good day. We must love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. And then we wonder why the watching world might not take the church seriously. It's like in that song that Alan and Keegan sang. When that song was new, the gentleman who wrote it and a friend of his made a video together to accompany the song, which illustrated lots of people that people might think were beyond the love of God. And we sit in our churches and perhaps we watch a video like that and say, oh, we're not like that. But really, upon reflection, if you sit on a bus or you sit on a tube train or you walk down King Street, it is very hard to do those things and say, I'm glad I'm not like that person. And we become the judges. But life is a journey, and each day we must try again and try to do better in this business of loving one another. And people sometimes say, oh, well, it means that we are to love our fellow believers, and surely it does, but there are other commandments that says we are to love our neighbors. And Jesus says that that includes everyone. And we are to love our enemies. And Jesus says that includes everyone. And by the time we're done, we find out that we have no room for hate or self-righteousness or judgmentalism. We figure out that the person who needs the doctor most is ourself. And we're not looking for a blood transfusion or a medication to be given to us. We are looking for a shot of love. We are looking for a infusion of God's love which allows us to love the other person. But we won't get it right today, which is not an excuse, but it is almost a guarantee. And we are on our way to the Father's house. Isabel played for us, In My Father's House. The tagline on that song is, In my Father's house, there's a place for me. And Jesus says, my Father's house has many rooms. And if that were not so, I would have told you. You know, I'm fond of making people smile when we have a funeral service by reminding them that in the authorized version, it says that in my Father's house, there are many mansions. Hey, I don't want a room in a heavenly Premier Lodge. I want a mansion. Not because I'm greedy, but just because it sounds nicer. And it also reminds me a little bit of what heaven might be like. And Jesus says, you know the way to the place where I am going. Now, I could have ended that reading at a different point, and there's a different discussion there. But I wanted to make the point really that the way to the place that Jesus is going is through the business of loving one another. It is through the business of belonging to Jesus. It is through the business of working during your life to be a person who is following God. It is hard to get lost if you are following well. So at the beginning of this passage, we have been told that it is night, and that night is kind of a spiritual reality as well as a physical thing. But even in the night, Jesus is glorified. And in his glorification, he teaches us, as he lays down his life, to love one another. And he says that these are the steps of following him to heavenly places, the Lord's house, the mansions on high, the place that he is going, has gone to prepare a place for us. And the people that he was speaking to were people that he knew were about to betray him, about to run away. And he didn't say, I'm going there to prepare a place for those who are always faithful, those who are always loyal, those who never run away. He says, I am going there to prepare a place for you. Despite our failings, despite our shortcomings. So turn away from judgmentalism and self-righteousness and turn towards loving your brothers and sisters and loving God. And then we walk the road that is the highway to heaven. Amen.